They stopped calling her by her name the day they decided she was no longer a person. The air inside processing chamber 7 smelled faintly of antiseptic and overheated circuitry, dry and metallic against the back of the throat, and the overhead light panels cast a sterile white glow across the polished floor where she stood barefoot, wrists encircled by a soft blue restraint field calibrated to 12% output, just enough to discourage movement without leaving a mark. A translucent screen hovered at eye level, scrolling lines of biometric data in clean corporate font, reproductive efficiency, 98.7%. Genetic stability, prime tier. Asset classification, breeding vessel. Lyra kept her gaze fixed on the far wall where a ventilation grate hummed at a steady 60 cycles per second, because it was easier to count the rhythm than to read the words that described her like livestock inventory. She had learned long ago that reacting only increased evaluation time. Across the room, a diagnostic array extended slender sensor arms around her silhouette, mapping bone density, hormone levels, cardiac response, all of it recorded and archived in less than 30 seconds. Inventory 47 is viable, one technician said without looking up from his tablet. He did not sound cruel. He sounded bored. That was worse. The chamber doors parted with a muted hydraulic sigh and Daniel Carter stepped inside carrying a ruggedized toolkit stamped with the logo of a mid-tier freight company out of Ohio. He was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered in a worn charcoal work jacket, light brown hair cut short in a way that suggested he cared more about function than style. He wasn't there for her. He was there because the DNA analyzer on the north wall had been throwing calibration errors for 3 straight days and management didn't like downtime on million-dollar equipment. He set his case down, glanced at the diagnostics panel, and frowned. Your thermal readings are drifting 2 degrees above baseline, he said, his voice even, American Midwest calm. One of the supervisors waved dismissively. Just fix the analyzer. The unit's numbers are excellent. The unit. Daniel followed the gesture without thinking, and that was when he actually saw her. Not the data. Not the classification. Her. Blue skin the color of deep ocean under winter light, silver hair pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck, shoulders held straight in a posture that looked less like submission and more like discipline. Her eyes were a muted metallic gray, focused somewhere beyond the room, as if she had stepped outside herself to survive it. The restraint field flickered softly around her wrists, emitting a faint static hiss that blended with the hum of the ventilation system. Daniel turned back to the console, fingers moving across the interface, but his gaze kept drifting to the label hovering beside her profile, asset number 47. He tapped into the system permissions, noting the drop-down menu that allowed minor metadata adjustments during recalibration. What's the unit's personal identifier? He asked, keeping his tone casual. The supervisor didn't look up. It doesn't have one. Just tag it 47 and clear the error. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He entered the maintenance override, the cursor blinking in the personal identifier field like a quiet dare. He looked up again, this time directly at her. What's your name? He asked, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, the steady rhythm of the ventilation hum seemed to falter. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, fragile and dangerous, and Lyra felt the restraint field around her wrists pulse half a degree warmer as if the system itself had noticed the deviation. No one had asked her that in cycles measured not in days but in fiscal quarters and transport schedules. Names had been inefficient, they had said. Names created attachment, and attachment reduced liquidity. She kept her eyes forward, yet she was suddenly aware of the human's breathing, steady and unhurried, the faint scent of engine oil clinging to his jacket, the quiet confidence in the way his fingers rested on the console instead of gripping it. Unit 47, the supervisor repeated, impatience edging his voice. Daniel did not look at him. The cursor in the personal identifier field continued to blink, waiting. I am required to input a confirmation tag, Daniel said evenly. System will not clear the calibration drift without a complete profile. That was not entirely true, but it sounded plausible enough wrapped in technical language. The supervisor exhaled sharply. Fine. Tag it as 47 Alpha. Just fix the machine. Daniel's gaze lifted again to Lyra's face. For a fraction of a second, her composure fractured. Not visibly to the others, but he saw it in the way her throat moved as she swallowed, in the slight tremor at the corner of her jaw. She had been trained to remain silent. Silence kept procedures short. Silence prevented penalties. If she gave a name, she would be claiming a history the system had already erased. The analyzer beside her emitted a soft chime, its internal temperature climbing 2 degrees Fahrenheit above optimal range, red indicators flickering along the edge of the display. Daniel reached over and adjusted the cooling parameter, buying himself a few more seconds. "What is your name?" he asked again, quieter this time, as if he were asking about the weather rather than challenging the foundation of the room. The word name felt foreign in her mind, like an artifact recovered from a collapsed city. She had once spoken it freely in halls lined with crystal lattice windows and gravity gardens that floated 12 feet above polished stone. She had once answered to it when addressed by elders who expected her to lead. Then politics shifted. Alliances fractured. Titles dissolved into debts. The restraint field hummed faintly, 12% output holding steady, but her pulse climbed beyond the baseline displayed on the screen. 90 beats per minute. 95. The technician glanced at the spike and frowned. "Keep the unit calm," he muttered. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, positioning his body between her and the others in a way that looked accidental but was not. "I cannot calibrate empathy thresholds without accurate data," he said, voice still level. "If you want peak efficiency, I need precision." The room fell into a thin, irritated silence. Lyra felt something unfamiliar pressing against the inside of her ribs, something that was not fear exactly but not safety either. The human was offering her a door, small and almost invisible, yet undeniably there. If she stepped through it, there would be consequences. If she did not, nothing would change. The ventilation grate continued its steady hum. 60 cycles per second. Reliable. Predictable. Unlike this moment. Her lips parted before she fully decided to let them move. The sound that emerged was soft, almost swallowed by the ambient noise. "Lyra," she said, and the syllables felt like reclaiming air after being underwater for too long. Daniel's fingers moved immediately, typing with deliberate clarity. "Lyra." The system paused. A warning icon flared amber across the screen. Personal identifier detected. Verification required. The supervisor straightened. "What did you input?" Daniel did not look away from the console. "Her name," he replied, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The amber warning icon pulsed across the console like a slow heartbeat, steady and insistent, and for a moment the entire chamber seemed to lean toward the screen as if the word he had typed carried measurable weight. "Verification required," the system repeated in precise corporate font, awaiting a supervisory override. The supervisor stepped closer, the polished floor reflecting the sharp lines of his boots, and Daniel could feel the subtle shift in the room's temperature as the cooling system compensated for rising processor load. 81 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. "Remove it," the supervisor said, voice tight. "Personal identifiers are restricted to registered citizens." Daniel did not move his hands away from the keyboard. He kept his posture relaxed, shoulders level, breathing even, as though he were still dealing with nothing more than a calibration drift. "The analyzer flagged a variance in hormonal response," he replied calmly. "Accurate identification reduces fluctuation variables by up to 4%. You want precision, this is how you get it." It was technical enough to sound legitimate, and just complicated enough to discourage further questions from someone who did not understand the machine. The supervisor hesitated, eyes flicking between the warning icon and the steadily scrolling biometric data beside Lyra's profile. Her pulse was slowly stabilizing now, descending from 95 beats per minute to 88, then 83. The numbers did not lie. The system registered improvement. Lyra stood perfectly still within the soft blue restraint field, yet inside her chest something had shifted. Hearing her name spoken aloud had not shattered the room or triggered alarms beyond the amber alert. The ceiling had not collapsed. The world had not ended. The syllables still echoed in her ears, fragile but undeniable. Lyra. Not Unit 47. Not inventory. The sound felt like warmth returning to a limb long kept in cold storage. Daniel selected the temporary authorization protocol and entered his technician credentials, accepting full responsibility for the metadata adjustment. A secondary warning flashed across the lower edge of the display, liability assigned to operator. He did not hesitate. He pressed confirm. The amber icon dimmed to a steady glow, unresolved but no longer escalating. The supervisor exhaled sharply through his nose. If this creates a compliance issue, it is on you, he said. Daniel nodded once. Understood. He adjusted the analyzer's cooling cycle, bringing the internal temperature back down 2 degrees, and the red indicators along the frame faded to green. The machine resumed its quiet, clinical hum, as if nothing significant had occurred. But something had. The profile beside Lyra's image now read personal identifier, Lyra. The letters looked small on the vast display, almost insignificant against the dense grid of genetic metrics and fertility projections, yet they changed the shape of the screen. Daniel stepped back slightly, giving the system space to finalize the recalibration, and allowed himself a brief glance at her. Their eyes met fully this time. There was confusion there, and disbelief, but beneath it a flicker of something older and steadier, something that did not belong to a product line. The restraint field continued its soft static hiss, still set at 12% output, but it no longer felt like the only thing defining her boundaries. Around them, technicians returned to their routines, satisfied that efficiency had been restored. Numbers were back within acceptable margins. Profits would proceed as forecast. Yet in the quiet margin between one data update and the next, a single human choice had rewritten a line of code that was never meant to exist, and Lyra felt the impossible sensation of being seen not as an asset, but as herself. The chamber gradually emptied as efficiency metrics returned to acceptable ranges, and the overhead lights dimmed by 5% to conserve power, casting longer shadows across the polished floor. The supervisor issued a final compliance reminder and exited through the sliding doors, his footsteps fading into the corridor's low mechanical hum. Only the steady ventilation and the faint static pulse of the restraint field remained. Daniel closed the maintenance panel and secured his toolkit, but he did not leave. He studied the console one last time, confirming that the personal identifier field still displayed Lyra in clean white letters against the blue interface. No automatic purge had triggered. No override had erased it. The system had accepted her name, at least for now. He stepped toward the restraint controls mounted at shoulder height along the wall. Calibration is complete, he said, his tone professional, measured. Restraint output can be reduced for recovery stabilization. He adjusted the field from 12% down to 5%. The soft blue glow around her wrists dimmed, no longer pressing against her skin with quiet insistence. Lyra felt the difference immediately. 5% was symbolic more than functional, but symbolism mattered. She lowered her hands slowly, as if testing whether the room would punish her for the movement. Nothing happened. The analyzer continued its quiet hum at a stable 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel retrieved a small cloth from his case and wiped a thin layer of condensation from one of the sensor arms, focusing on the task to avoid making the moment heavier than it already was. You can sit if you need to, he said, nodding toward a narrow bench against the far wall. The offer was simple, almost casual. She had not been offered comfort in this room before. Lyra hesitated, then took 2 measured steps toward the bench. The restraint field adjusted automatically to her movement, maintaining its minimal output without resistance. She sat carefully, posture straight out of habit, hands resting on her knees. Daniel moved to the auxiliary terminal and began entering post-calibration notes, documenting routine adjustments in language that would pass compliance review. Beneath the technical phrasing, one line stood out: subject response stabilized following identifier confirmation. It was understated, but it was true. Silence settled between them, not tense but unfamiliar. The chamber felt different now, less like a processing station and more like a room containing two individuals. Daniel glanced at her again, this time without the barrier of a screen. "Lyra," he said, testing the sound of it in normal conversation rather than in defiance. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and there was less distance in them than before. "You altered the system for efficiency," she said quietly, repeating the official explanation. It was not a question. He allowed a faint, almost tired smile. "That is what the report will say." The ventilation continued its steady rhythm, 60 cycles per second, constant and reliable. Outside the chamber, transport carts rolled along magnetic tracks, carrying other units to other evaluations. Inside, the console still displayed her name, small against the vast architecture of data, yet impossible to ignore. Lyra felt something steadying within her, a recalibration no machine had initiated. The field around her wrists hummed softly at 5% output, but for the first time since entering the facility, the boundaries around her identity did not feel absolute. And Daniel, closing his toolkit with a muted click, understood that he had not repaired a machine. He had adjusted a line of code in a system that had forgotten what a name was worth. The chamber lights shifted to evening mode as the facility's central clock crossed 1900 hours, bathing the walls in a softer white that felt almost human, almost gentle. Daniel checked the maintenance log one final time and transmitted the completed report to operations, watching the progress bar crawl from 0 to 100% before the screen confirmed submission. Across the room, Lyra remained seated on the narrow bench, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the restraint field still humming at 5% output like a distant echo rather than a command. The data display beside her profile continued to scroll fertility projections and genetic forecasts, indifferent to the change that had taken place. Yet the small identifier at the top of the column still read Lyra, and each time her eyes drifted to it she felt the quiet shock of recognition. Daniel powered down the analyzer's auxiliary array and slid his tablet into his jacket pocket. He should leave. His job was finished. Another technician would take over the next evaluation cycle. The rational path was simple: walk out, collect payment, forget the room. Instead, he crossed the space between them with unhurried steps and stopped a respectful distance away, about 3 feet, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "They will review the log," he said, tone calm. "The identifier may trigger questions." Lyra inclined her head slightly. "You accepted liability," she replied, her voice steady now, the earlier tremor gone. "Why?" The question carried no accusation, only curiosity shaped by caution. Daniel considered his answer carefully. The ventilation hummed overhead, steady at 60 cycles per second, and somewhere down the corridor a transport cart glided past with a low magnetic whine. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary workday. "Because systems do not change themselves," he said at last. "Sometimes someone has to press confirm." Lyra studied him as though recalibrating her understanding of his species. In her experience, humans were transactional, efficient, driven by contracts and margins. Yet this one had risked professional sanction for a detail that offered no measurable profit. The restraint field flickered softly as she shifted her wrists, testing the reduced output again. "If they remove it," she said quietly, glancing at the identifier on the screen, "what then?" Daniel followed her gaze. "Then I will enter it again," he answered, almost matter of fact. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than defiance would have. There was no dramatic vow in his tone, no promise of rescue fleets or rebellion. Just persistence. A choice repeated as many times as necessary. The overhead clock ticked forward another minute. The analyzer's status light glowed green, stable at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, as if the machine itself approved of the equilibrium. Lyra drew a slow breath, filling her lungs fully for the first time since entering the chamber. "Lyra," she repeated softly, not for the system this time, but for herself. The syllables no longer felt fragile. Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging the sound as something solid. Outside, footsteps approached, signaling the shift change. The moment would not last much longer. Yet within the sterile geometry of steel and light, something fundamental had shifted. She was still bound by contracts and classifications, still standing inside a structure designed to reduce her to metrics. But there was now a record, however small, that said she had a name. And there was a human willing to press confirm again. The approaching footsteps stopped just outside the chamber doors, followed by the soft chime that signaled an incoming shift, and Daniel felt the weight of time settling back into place like a closing circuit. The room would not remain suspended in this fragile equilibrium for long. He glanced at the wall display where Lyra's profile remained active, her identifier still anchored at the top of the column, small but undeniable. The overhead lights brightened slightly as the facility adjusted to the new personnel cycle, casting sharper reflections across the polished floor. Lyra rose from the bench without being instructed, posture straight, composure restored, yet something in her stance had changed. The restraint field continued its low 5% hum, but she no longer held her hands as if expecting invisible pressure. She held them as if they belonged to her. The doors parted with a hydraulic whisper, admitting two new technicians in crisp gray uniforms carrying tablets and thermal scanners. Their eyes moved first to the analyzer, confirming the green status indicators, then to the subject standing within the field. One of them paused, frowning slightly at the identifier on the screen. "Why is there a personal tag?" he asked, voice edged with procedural concern. Daniel stepped forward before Lyra could respond. "Temporary calibration variable," he said evenly. "Subject stabilization improved by 4.2% after identifier confirmation. Data is in the log." He tapped the console, pulling up the performance graph that showed the steady decline in her elevated pulse rate. Numbers spoke fluently in this building. The technician studied the chart, his expression shifting from suspicion to reluctant approval. "Efficiency metrics are within optimal range," he admitted. "Compliance will review the anomaly." Daniel gave a single nod. "They can review the results." The exchange was clinical, controlled, yet beneath it a quiet tension threaded the air. Lyra observed the interaction carefully. The human did not raise his voice. He did not challenge authority with defiance. He simply anchored his argument in measurable improvement, translating dignity into data the system could not easily dismiss. The second technician activated a portable scanner, its beam sweeping gently across her frame to confirm baseline readings. "Identifier does not alter biological output," he said after a moment. "Proceed with next cycle." The words should have reduced her once more to function. Forecasts and classifications, one word remained. And for the first time since she had been processed as inventory, Lyra understood that a system built on numbers could be unsettled by something as simple as being called by her name. The corridor outside processing chamber 7 felt colder than before, the recycled air brushing against Daniel's face as he walked toward the service elevators with his toolkit slung over one shoulder. Overhead lights flickered in steady intervals, reflecting off brushed steel walls that carried the faint smell of disinfectant and ionized air. He should have felt finished. Work order complete. Analyzer recalibrated. Liability acknowledged. Instead, a subtle pressure settled between his shoulder blades, the quiet awareness that systems did not appreciate deviation. His wrist comm unit vibrated once, then twice. Incoming notice from compliance review. He stopped beside a maintenance hatch and read the message projected across his screen. Temporary identifier entry detected. Report to administrative oversight at 0800 hours tomorrow. The words were polite. They were not optional. Daniel exhaled slowly. 8 in the morning. 12 hours from now. He closed the notification and resumed walking, boots echoing softly along the corridor floor. Back inside the chamber, Lyra stood beneath the cool white lights while the new technicians finalized her evaluation cycle. The portable scanner emitted a low harmonic tone as it completed its sweep, registering stable metrics across every category. Efficient. Profitable. Predictable. One technician tapped his tablet and paused again at the identifier. Compliance flagged this, he muttered. Personal designation requires executive authorization. The other shrugged, to holding quarters. The field adjusted automatically as she stepped forward, maintaining minimal containment without resistance. The corridor beyond the chamber stretched long and sterile, lined with identical doors and identical lights. She walked past them with measured steps, silver hair catching the overhead glow, her name still glowing at the top of her profile in the system's network. In a different wing of the facility, Daniel stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lower docking level. The doors closed with a muted seal, enclosing him in a narrow column of reflective metal. For a brief moment, he saw his own reflection staring back at him, tired eyes, oil-stained jacket, a human who had pressed confirm on a line that was not meant to exist. He knew what oversight would say. Policy. Asset classification. Liability. They would frame it as an error. He leaned his head back against the cool steel wall as the elevator descended 20 floors, feeling the subtle vibration beneath his boots. He could correct the entry in the morning. Delete the identifier. Restore compliance. It would take less than 10 seconds. Inside her transport corridor, Lyra slowed her pace almost imperceptibly and whispered her name under her breath, testing whether it still felt real when no human stood nearby. It did. And somewhere between the humming elevators and the quiet holding cells, an unspoken question formed in both their minds. When the system demands correction, who will press confirm next? Administrative oversight occupied the top level of the facility, where the walls were no longer brushed steel but dark composite glass that reflected the city lights beyond the dome, thousands of white and amber points suspended against a violet night sky. At exactly 800 hours, Daniel stood alone in the reception corridor, toolkit absent this time, hands empty at his sides. The air felt cooler here, precisely regulated at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying none of the industrial scent from the lower levels. A silent assistant drone hovered near the ceiling, projecting his name in thin blue letters and directing him through a set of tall doors that opened without a sound. Inside, the room was wide and minimalist, a single curved table facing a panoramic display of financial charts and asset projections. 3 officials sat evenly spaced behind the table, their tablets aligned in perfect symmetry. On the central screen, Lyra's profile rotated slowly in 3-dimensional scan format, genetic markers highlighted in gold. And at the top of the projection, unmistakable, was her identifier. One official tapped the screen and the letters enlarged. Technician Carter, he began, voice measured and devoid of hostility, you assigned a personal designation to registered property without executive authorization. Daniel did not shift his stance. I entered an identifier during calibration to stabilize subject metrics, he replied calmly. The display changed, showing a graph of her biometric response before and after the entry. Pulse rate decline. Hormonal stabilization. Compliance probability increased by 4.2%. The numbers glowed in clean white lines. You are aware that personal designation implies personhood under interspecies accords, another official said. This facility does not process persons. Daniel held their gaze, one by one. Your own data shows improved stability, he said. Efficiency increased. Output consistency improved. If the goal is performance, the identifier achieved it. Silence settled across the polished floor, heavy but not aggressive. They were not angry. They were calculating. On the lower levels, Lyra stood within her holding chamber, a smaller space lined with soft containment panels and low ambient lighting set to simulate dusk. A narrow display panel embedded in the wall flickered as system updates propagated across the network. She watched the small line of text beneath her profile shift from pending review to executive evaluation. She did not know the outcome yet. She only knew that her name was being discussed in a room she had once been born to enter, long before debts and politics had reduced her status. She closed her eyes briefly and steadied her breathing, remembering Daniel's tone when he had said he would enter it again. Back in oversight, the central official leaned back slightly. If we remove the identifier, he said, metrics may regress. If we allow it, we establish precedent. Daniel understood what they were weighing. Not compassion. Not morality. Precedent. He nodded once. Then make it policy, he answered quietly. Assign identifiers when it improves stability. Let the data justify it. The room fell still. Beyond the glass walls, city lights shimmered like distant stars. In her chamber below, Lyra felt her wall display refresh. The profile rotated once more, then stabilized. At the top of the column, her name remained. Not flagged. Not pending. Active. The restraint field in her chamber hummed at. Minimal output, but for the first time since her processing began, the system had acknowledged something it was never designed to measure. And in a quiet room high above her, a human technician had argued for her existence using nothing but numbers and a steady voice. The decision did not arrive with applause or ceremony, only a quiet system update that rippled through the facility at 9:23 in the morning, adjusting policy language by a single clause. Personal identifiers permitted when demonstrably beneficial to asset stability. In the oversight chamber, the panoramic display shifted from Lyra's profile to quarterly projections, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Daniel stood for a moment longer, absorbing the stillness, then inclined his head once in acknowledgement. No medals. No gratitude. Just a line of code allowed to remain. He turned and walked out of the glass-walled office, the city lights now dimmed beneath daylight filtering through the dome, his reflection faint against the polished corridor walls. The elevator carried him back down 20 floors, descending through layers of industry and protocol, until the doors opened onto the holding wing. The air here carried the soft hum of containment fields and climate control units set to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not have clearance to enter individual chambers without request, but he paused outside Lyra's door, where a narrow observation panel displayed her active profile. At the top of the column, in steady white letters, her name remained. No warning icons. No pending flags. Just Lyra. Inside the chamber, she stood near the embedded display, watching the final confirmation cycle complete. The wall panel glowed briefly as the updated policy synchronized across the network. She felt the shift like a subtle change in gravity, not dramatic, but undeniable. The restraint field around her wrists maintained its minimal 5% output, a procedural constant, yet it no longer defined the boundaries of her existence. She sensed movement outside the chamber and turned slightly, silver hair catching the soft overhead light. Through the narrow panel she saw him, posture relaxed, hands at his sides, not attempting to enter, not claiming ownership of the outcome. He simply stood there long enough to ensure the update had taken effect. Their eyes met through the reinforced glass. No words were necessary. In that silent exchange lay something neither contracts nor metrics could quantify. Daniel gave the smallest nod, the same steady acknowledgement he had offered when he first asked her name. Then he stepped back, turning toward the corridor that led to the docking levels and the ordinary routines of his life. He would return to freight ships and faulty analyzers and maintenance logs written in practical language. He would not be remembered in official reports beyond a notation of compliance adjustment. Inside the chamber, Lyra approached the display and raised her hand, hovering her fingertips just inches from the glowing letters that identified her. She did not need to touch them. They were real without contact. Beyond the holding wing, the facility continued its cycles of evaluation and projection, numbers flowing across screens in endless streams. Yet somewhere within that architecture of profit and prediction, a precedent had been set. A system designed to measure output had acknowledged identity because one human insisted on entering it. Lyra drew a slow breath and stood taller, not as inventory, not as a projection, but as herself. And in a place ruled by percentages and policy, the simplest act had proven the most disruptive. He did not break the system. He reminded it what a name was worth.